This is the plague that never let go. In the summer of 1592, London's theatres closed by government order, and they do not reopen in any meaningful way for almost 2 years. Everyone treats this as a footnote in the story of English literature. It was not a footnote, it was the closest a single disease ever came to erasing the language as we know it, because somewhere inside that closure is a 28-year-old actor and jobbing playwright named William Shakespeare, and by the time the theatres reopen in 1594, he has written almost nothing that survives to explain why anyone should remember his name. So what if he never gets the chance to? What if the plague that shut him down in 1592 is the plague that finishes the job? Here is where it starts. In 1592, Shakespeare is not yet Shakespeare. He is one of a dozen working playwrights scrambling for commissions in a city that has just lost its stages. Christopher Marlowe is the famous one, the one audiences actually pay to see. Robert Greene is dying and bitter enough to publish an attack calling Shakespeare an upstart crow dressed in other men's feathers, beautified with their words. That insult, written out of pure professional resentment on a deathbed, is the only reason we know for certain Shakespeare was even working as a playwright by 1592. Strip that one reference out of the historical record, and the paper trail on his early career gets thin fast. We are talking about a man whose entire claim to a place in history rests on fragments this small. During the closure, Shakespeare survives historically by writing narrative poetry for a patron, the Earl of Southampton, Venus and Adonis in 1593, The Rape of Lucrece in 1594. This is not incidental. This is the difference between a man who has an income during a 2-year theatre shutdown and a man who does not. Take the patronage away, and you take away the bridge that carries him from a jobbing actor in 1592 to the playwright who opens with Titus Andronicus, and the Henry VI plays the moment the theatres come back in 1594. So here is the divergence. In our version, Southampton's patronage doesn't land. Maybe the introduction never happens, some go-between who never makes the connection, some letter that never gets written. Maybe Shakespeare catches the plague himself in the winter of 1593, survives the fever the way so many Londoners did not, but loses 6 months he never gets back. And by the time he is well enough to work, Southampton has already funded someone else. This world was that close to existing. We know poets who tried for exactly this kind of patronage and failed, whose names survive only as footnotes to the men who succeeded. Shakespeare succeeding was not inevitable. It was one relationship in one specific 18-month window that could easily have gone the other way. Without it, the man from Stratford does what most jobbing actors who lose 2 years of income do. He goes home. Maybe he keeps a hand in the family glove trade. Maybe he teaches grammar school somewhere in Warwickshire, the way some biographers already suspect he did in his so-called lost years before 1592. The record simply stops the way it stops for dozens of his contemporaries whose names survive only as entries in parish registers and court documents nobody reads anymore. Now follows what doesn't happen next, because this is where the shape of English culture actually changes. There is no Lord Chamberlain's men built around a resident playwright-actor delivering a new script every few months like clockwork. The company that historically becomes Shakespeare's professional home in 1594 reorganizes around other writers, likely Thomas Kyd if he survives his own brush with the authorities in 1593, or a younger George Chapman still building his reputation. The company survives. The theatre business survives. Elizabethan London does not stop wanting entertainment just because one specific author never turns up. What does not exist is the specific creative engine that, in our timeline, produces roughly 38 plays across 2 decades from one mind working inside one company, testing ideas in front of the same audiences, the same actors, refining the same handful of obsessions about power and grief and disguise and language across 3 decades of practice. Most playwrights of the era wrote for whoever paid. Shakespeare, uniquely, wrote for the same room, the same actors, for 20 years. That continuity is not a small thing to lose. That refinement is the part that is genuinely hard to replace. Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre does not lack talent in this scenario. It lacks the specific accumulation. Marlowe, if he survives past 1593 instead of dying in a Deptford tavern brawl under circumstances that remain disputed to this day, becomes the dominant voice of the era by default. He is already the more famous name in 1592. He is already pushing blank verse further than anyone else, writing for the English stage. Give him the 2 additional decades that history denied him, and Marlowe becomes what Shakespeare became. The mighty line, as Ben Jonson called it admiringly, keeps developing, but it develops through a different temperament entirely. Marlowe's Edward II and Dr. Faustus are colder, more intellectual, more openly transgressive than anything Shakespeare wrote. A Marlowe-centered dramatic tradition produces a different English theatre, more Machiavellian, more interested in ambition and damnation than in reconciliation, less interested in the mercy and forgiveness that closes out Shakespeare's late plays. The Tempest in this world simply does not exist, and neither does the entire late career turn toward forgiveness that it represents. Prospero breaking his staff instead of taking his revenge. Ben Jonson still writes. He is talented enough and stubborn enough that his career does not depend on anyone else's existence. Volpone and the Alchemist still happen, and Jonson, freed from being permanently cast as Shakespeare's rival and lesser correspondent. The man who wrote the famous epitaph calling Shakespeare not of an age, but for all time, becomes by consensus the greatest playwright of the age in his own right. English drama in the early 1600s becomes known as an age of wit, satire, and classical form, Jonson's specialties, rather than an age remembered for psychological depth and linguistic invention. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it changes what English playwrights spend the next 2 centuries trying to imitate. You cannot aspire to write like Hamlet if Hamlet never gets written. You aspire to write like Volpone instead, sharper, funnier, colder, and far less interested in a man's private doubt. Now here is the part that is genuinely strange to sit with. The English language itself changes. Shakespeare did not just write plays. He is credited, depending on which lexicographer you trust, with introducing somewhere between 1,700 and 3,000 words and phrases into common English usage, either coining them outright or being the first person to put them on paper in a form that stuck. Words like lonely, bedroom, eyeball, generous, gossip, assassination, phrases like breaking the ice, wild goose chase, in a pickle, heart of gold, the world is my oyster. Take one man's 4-decade output out of the linguistic record, and English does not stop growing, but it grows through different mouths at a different pace, absorbing a different set of coinages from playwrights who prioritized different things. Without Shakespeare's phrase-making instinct as the dominant literary influence on the language, the King James Bible, translated between 1604 and 1611 by dozens of scholars working under royal commission, becomes even more singularly dominant as the shaping force on English idiom than it already was. English in this timeline sounds more biblical and less theatrical, more formal cadence, fewer of the compressed, punchy coinages that came out of a man writing for actors who needed lines that landed in 3 seconds in a packed, standing room theatre where half the audience was heckling and the other half was eating hazelnuts. Move forward a century and the absence compounds. The Shakespeare we know was not actually the towering cultural figure of his own era. He becomes that figure gradually, largely through the efforts of 2 actors, John Hemingway and Henry Condell, who in 1623, 7 years after his death, compiled the First Folio. 36 plays, roughly half of which, including Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and Twelfth Night, would have been lost forever without that single act of posthumous editing and loyalty. Without a body of work to compile, there is no First Folio. There is no single unifying document that later scholars, actors, and nation builders can point to and say, here, this is the foundation, this is what English drama produced at its peak. And that foundation mattered for something bigger than literature. In the 18th century, as Britain expands into a global empire, it needs a cultural argument for its own exceptionalism that isn't just naval power and trade routes. Shakespeare becomes that argument. David Garrick's Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford in 1769 a 3-day festival that was rained out for most of its duration and still somehow succeeded in cementing a myth, is not really a theatre festival. It is the moment English culture decides it has produced a genius equal to anything Rome or Greece ever managed, and builds a national identity partly around that claim. Remove Shakespeare from the equation, and the empire still finds its cultural totem. It always does, but it likely finds it in Milton instead. Paradise Lost, already respected, becomes the unquestioned peak of English literary achievement, and Milton's furious, theological, argumentative sensibility, not Shakespeare's ambiguous, character-driven one, becomes what English-speaking culture holds up as its highest literary value. That is not a small substitution. Shakespeare's plays are famous for refusing to tell you what to think. Hamlet doesn't resolve. Measure for Measure doesn't resolve. The plays sit in moral ambiguity and trust the audience to do the work themselves, walking out of the theatre still arguing about who was right. Milton's Paradise Lost, whatever its genius, is an argument. It is trying, in its own words, to justify the ways of God to men. A literary tradition that grows up idolizing Milton instead of Shakespeare inherits a culture more comfortable with certainty and less practiced at holding contradictory truths in the same sentence without resolving them. Now push this even further, because the effects do not stop at English borders. In our timeline, German intellectuals in the late 18th century essentially adopt Shakespeare as their own. Johann Gottfried Herder and the young Goethe treat him as the model for a new kind of national literature more important to German Romanticism than almost any homegrown writer. Goethe called him inexhaustible. German productions of Shakespeare become so central to German theatre that by the 19th century, some critics only half joke that Shakespeare was more thoroughly absorbed into German culture than English culture ever managed to absorb him back. That entire cross-pollination, an English playwright becoming one of the intellectual engines of German Romanticism, doesn't happen in this world. German Romanticism still emerges. It still produces Goethe, still produces Schiller, but it develops without that particular foreign influence, pulling it towards psychological ambiguity and character-driven tragedy, and instead leans further into its own homegrown classical and folk traditions. The entire European Romantic movement, which historically owes a real debt to Shakespeare's example, has to find its blueprint for the tortured, ambiguous protagonist somewhere else, and it likely finds a thinner version of it. Follow this forward again, and it reaches into rooms you would not expect. Sigmund Freud, writing in Vienna at the end of the 19th century, builds part of his entire theory of unconscious motivation around Hamlet, arguing that the prince's paralysis reveals something universal about repressed desire that he names the Oedipus complex partly through that play. Freud is drawing on a text that, in this timeline, was never written. That does not mean psychoanalysis fails to exist. Freud was going to find his evidence somewhere, but he loses one of his most famous literary case studies, the one he returned to again and again across his career, and the entire vocabulary of modern psychology that leans on Shakespearean characters as shorthand, a Macbeth-like guilt, an Iago-like manipulation, a Lear-like fall from power, simply isn't available to borrow. Psychology in this world has to build its own shorthand from different sources, and that shorthand almost certainly ends up less literary and more clinical, because the substitute sources, whatever they are, were never woven as tightly into everyday cultured speech as Shakespeare's characters were. American education, built substantially on British literary tradition, still teaches Shakespeare in almost every high school in the country in our world, not because policymakers sat down and voted for it, but because 2 centuries of momentum made it feel inevitable. The default answer to what serious literature looks like. Take Shakespeare's plays out of that inheritance, and the entire architecture of what English-speaking students are assumed to have read by the time they graduate shifts toward whoever filled the vacuum, most likely Marlowe and Jonson jointly, with Milton anchoring the poetry side. Psychologically driven character study, the specific thing Shakespeare is most credited with pioneering on the English stage, becomes a later development in the novel rather than something inherited from the theatre 200 years earlier. Which means when the novel does emerge as the dominant literary form in the 18th century, with writers like Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, it has less of a direct ancestor to build from, and its own development toward interior psychological realism likely takes longer to mature. Jane Austen is still Jane Austen. Her eye for irony and character doesn't depend on Shakespeare specifically, but the tradition she is writing into, the assumption that a character's inner contradictions are worth pages of careful attention, arrives to her a full century later than it did in our world, carried by different books entirely, and her own innovations land as more radical, more isolated, because she has less of a dramatic inheritance standing behind her. Even the film industry inherits this gap more than a century later. Somewhere on the order of 1,000 film and television adaptations of Shakespeare's plays exist in our timeline, an entire renewable resource of pre-tested, public domain, universally recognized narrative material that has fed actors, directors, and studios for over a century of cinema. Laurence Olivier's Hamlet in 1948, the first British film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. Akira Kurosawa restaging Macbeth as Throne of Blood and King Lear as Ran, taking Shakespeare's tragedies and rebuilding them inside feudal Japan without losing a shred of their force. West Side Story rebuilding Romeo and Juliet for 1950s. New York, one of the most successful movie musicals ever made, resting entirely on a 400-year-old plot about two feuding families. Take that resource away, and every one of those adaptations either doesn't exist or gets built on entirely different source material, most plausibly on Marlowe, whose Dr. Faustus and the Jew of Malta are dramatic enough to survive translation to film, but whose surviving catalogue is a fraction of the size Shakespeare's is, which means far fewer stories available to keep reworking generation after generation, decade after decade, in 100 different languages and settings. Every actor who ever built a career partly on playing Hamlet on the specific, brutal challenge of that specific role, 4 hours of a man talking himself in and out of revenge, is building a career on something that never existed. The Royal Shakespeare Company itself, founded in 1961 and still one of the most prestigious theatre institutions on the planet, has no reason to exist under that name because there is no single author whose complete surviving works justify a standing national theatre company built entirely around them. Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town that in our world draws millions of tourists a year purely because one man happened to be born there in 1564, stays a market town. Nothing more, nothing less. Here is what I find strange to sit with when I look at the whole shape of it. Nothing about this alternate world is worse exactly. English theatre still flourishes. English poetry still flourishes. The language still grows. Empires still find their cultural totems. Film still adapts its classics from whatever source material history left it. But the entire emotional register of English-speaking culture, its comfort with ambiguity, its specific vocabulary for grief and love and self-doubt, its instinct that a villain can be sympathetic and a hero can be wrong, and that neither fact cancels the other out, traces back through one man's plays more directly than most people realize, until you try to imagine pulling the thread out and watching what unravels with it. And it very nearly didn't happen. 2 years, one closed theatre, one patron who might never have written that letter, one fever that could have run 6 months longer than it did. That's the entire hinge this whole 400-year inheritance swings on. Not a battle, not a law. A patronage arrangement between a young poet and a young earl that could have failed for a dozen small, unrecorded reasons, and almost certainly did fail in exactly this way for other poets we've simply never heard of. Men whose names disappeared the moment their income did. If you think a different playwright would have carried the language just as far, tell me who and tell me why down in the comments. I want to see the argument made properly. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind where the whole shape of a culture turns on something this small, a closed theatre, a missed introduction, a fever that goes one way instead of the other, subscribe, because we're doing more of these. I'll see you on the next one.